Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Thursday night Bible study, exploring the Bible again, and another half to three-quarters, maybe even an hour of Tim and myself to experience.
I think we should start out by being honest, Steve. When has it ever been half an hour?
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yes, I'll try not to speak so much tonight, although can't guarantee that. But anyway, good evening, everyone, and welcome along tonight. And as I probably should update this slide. It seems to be growing each week in the sense of how many minutes Tim talks, particularly. But we'll go with that at the moment. Please write your questions in the Q&A. I know I had a bit of feedback that Q&A may not always be that easy to find. Maybe if you push the more button, there's a few dots, you might find that. But I have enabled a chat tonight as well, so. Well, I guess the only thing about chat is everybody's going to see what you've asked. So as long as you're happy with that, that's fine. Um, please be respectful. Please participate if you'd like. And you can even turn on your camera if you wish. That's entirely up to you. So with that, I might ask Tim, please, if you would mind opening with a prayer for us tonight.
Sure. Holy Father, we ask for your blessing on this time that we are grateful for. We are thankful for your care for us during the day, and we pray, Father, that you will be with all of your children this night. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, tonight our topic we're up to the week 4, the Law of Moses. However, I guess it's a bit of a pre-warning. I'm going to be talking a little bit about history leading up to the Law of Moses. So probably Tim's more going to be talking about the law itself. So we won't be diving straight into the Law of Moses first. We're going to sort of go on a little bit of a journey as to how the law came about and some of the history really from the time
Hmm.
of Abraham up to then. Okay, so even though it's called the Law of Moses, we're going to go back in time a little bit and have a look at another period of history here. And now we're looking at the patriarchs. Well, we're going, I suppose, a bit beyond the patriarchs, but I suppose we move on in history to, a, a, I suppose, a period known in this slide anyway, this timeline, as the formation of Israel. And it covers a period of some 500 years, and it sort of follows the descendants of Abram as they developed from a single man's faith, which is why Abram was chosen, and how it sort of exploded really into a family of hundreds of thousands that we sort of see at the end there, where we have Exodus on that timeline just after the 1500. And last week we looked at this timeline, or this family tree, I suppose is probably more accurate, and we saw how God selected Abram due to his personal belief in the true God of the universe, as opposed to the common practice at the time of worshipping wood and stone idols. So from the family tree, we see after the Isaac and Jacob, that Jacob's name was changed, and his name was changed from Jacob, meaning a supplanter, to Israel, meaning prince with God. And this was, I suppose, reflective of the purpose that God had with the descendants of Abram. And we can see, on the screen there that there was 12 sons of Jacob, or 12, what they became known as the 12 tribes of Israel, although with slight variation, because one of them, Joseph, actually he wasn't one of the tribes. Two of his sons became tribes, and Levi became dedicated for another purpose. Now, one of the sons, this son Joseph, I'm sure you've all heard the story. He's the one who had that coat of many colors. Um, and it's a story of how jealous brothers ended up trying to get rid of Joseph, the favorite son of his father Jacob. And they sold him uh, to Egypt to live a life of slavery. Now, it's interesting, before we get into that a little bit more, it's interesting to note that in Genesis 15, amongst the promises that were given to Abraham's, there's this prophecy. And it's a prophecy about this exact thing, how that Egypt was going to be involved with I suppose, the development of this nation that was going to come out of Egypt. So know certainly that your descendants will be strangers, this is talking to Abraham, in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. In the fourth generation your descendants will return here. So that's where we were sort of talking about that 500-year period that we saw in our timeline. And yeah, basically the family of Jacob ended up in Egypt. And so let's just talk about how that happened. Like I say, I think we all know this story. It spans the remainder of the book of Genesis, from chapter 37 to the end. And it's one of those captivating stories that draws you in further and further, and you just can't put it down once you get going with the story. It's well worth a read if you haven't read it before. So maybe try that out for homework this week if you're not familiar with it. And we can see in this particular story the hand of God, who is behind the scenes in just about everything that occurs. So Joseph, the dreamer, loved of his father, was in turn hated by his brothers. He was sold into Egypt by 10 of the jealous brothers, pretending that he had been killed by a wild animal. He arrived in Egypt, became a servant to a wealthy Egyptian by the name of Potiphar, who trusted Joseph entirely. And because of this trust, Potiphar prospered, and he did very well out of this relationship with Joseph, because God blessed him. However, his wife, that's Potiphar's wife, was also thought well of Joseph, but not for the right reasons. And when she attempted to allure him, Joseph fleeing from the house, she managed to grab his coat and use that to accuse Joseph of inappropriate advances on her. And as you can imagine, Joseph got into trouble and ended up in prison, and he spent quite a number of years in prison. During that time, he interpreted a couple of fellow prisoners' dreams, some servants of the king. So we can imagine from that it must have been sort of like the royal prison, potentially, where the kings and the famous people sent their prisoners. And the interpretation of this butler and baker who were sent there came out exactly as God had revealed to Joseph. And it was some years later that Pharaoh himself had a couple of dreams, and no one had any idea what they were all about. And at that time, the butler who had been restored to his position serving Pharaoh remembered Joseph and how he had interpreted his dreams, and mentioned this to Pharaoh, which ended up Joseph being brought hastily out of prison, where through God's assistance he foretold what the dreams were all about. And there was a prophecy that there would be 7 good harvest years, followed by 7 years of severe famine. And Joseph was promoted by Pharaoh, and he prepared the nation for this famine by storing food in those good years. And this benefited Pharaoh. He became very wealthy because particularly during the famine years when he had all this stored grain, and basically everybody in the world came to Egypt to trade and to buy food. Jacob, Israel, as we could probably refer to him now, and his family, became the Israelites, they ran out of food, and so they came to Egypt to buy more. And after a series of tests by Joseph to his family, he revealed himself to them, and it ended up with Israel moving to Egypt because the famine was still going to be in their land for quite a number of years, and basically they were given some of the best land in Israel, due to obviously Joseph's influence there, and that's where they remained for 400 years. And I guess one of the things that I see in Joseph's life, which comes fairly obvious, is it's a bit of a life, a bit of a parable, should I say, of the plan of salvation that God has through, or who has promised through Jesus Christ. So Jesus, the Son of God, typically experienced life in Egypt too. He had our nature. He was betrayed by jealous peers. He experienced hardship, and even death in his case. But in the end, he ensured the survival of God's people. And that's exactly what God has sent Jesus to do. Now, one thing too, that looking at that little parable, Egypt is expressed typically in the Bible as a place of darkness, sin, and bondage. And it's interesting that in the New Testament we see this parable almost coming to life, and when here another Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, took the toddler Jesus and his mother into Egypt for a time, and so they literally, after a period of time, came out of Egypt. And he's showing his role as the one who would save us from the bondage of sin and death. And I guess elsewhere in the Old Testament, there's references to this whole idea of keeping away from Egypt, wouldn't you say, Tim? Where a lot of the kings were told, particularly not to go down to Egypt, because I think they obviously must have bred horses and things like that down there, and they made chariots and that type of thing. So there was this warning about not going back to Egypt, but I think despite that, quite a number of them still did.
Well, we had Isaac before that you mentioned, Steve, and he was told explicitly by God not to go down to Egypt in a time of famine, interestingly enough.
Yeah. All right. So moving on then, though Joseph may have saved Israel and the Egyptians, time rolled on, and subsequent pharaohs became less impressed with this Israelite presence on their doorstep, and this growing population that seemed to be getting larger and larger, and they began to feel threatened. And so they decided that they were going to put a stop to it by making them slaves. But this didn't really work, and so they came up with another plan. And we are introduced to the character Moses as we commence the book that we are called, the second book of the Bible, called Exodus. Now, Pharaoh commands the Egyptian midwives to kill all the Israelitish male children when they are born. And it's quite likely that throwing them in the Nile might have been one of the ways that was done. One couple, descendants of Levi, Amram and Jochebed, they hid their newly born son in a little woven basket, like a boat in the river. And we find that Pharaoh's daughter ended up finding him and took her as her own son. I think in the sense of probably thinking that the gods had given her this child. Moses ended up being cared for by his parents on behalf of Pharaoh's daughter. So that was quite incredible as it was, another hand of God being involved there. So Moses grew up in Pharaoh's court, spending 40 years there, learning about all the Egyptian ways. And at 40 years old, he went out to see his people. So he sort of recognized he was an Israelite. And he struck an Egyptian down who was mistreating one of his fellow Israelites. And after this event, um, the Egyptians didn't particularly, well, sorry, the Israelites weren't particularly happy with this offer or this interference by Moses, and also the Egyptians found out about it, and so he had to basically leave in quite a hurry, and he ended up spending 40 years in exile in Midian. But after a while, he returned to Egypt at God's command. An angel appeared at the burning bush to call him back, and then Moses eventually led the Israelites out of Egypt. Didn't actually happen that easily. And we see really the struggle that occurred between the king of Egypt and the king of the universe being played out in these early chapters of Exodus. Pharaoh was definitely not letting his slave labor leave the country. And so God sent a series of plagues to encourage Pharaoh that resistance was futile. And in the process, the God of the universe actually discredited all of these so-called Egyptian gods and displayed without a doubt who really was in control. And so through this series of plagues, yeah, basically all the gods of Egypt were completely discredited and embarrassed, I'm sure. These plagues actually became, and I suppose why I've called it God's power revealed, they became notorious for years. In fact, 40 years later, when the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, finally managed to weave their way through the wilderness and come to the border of the promised land, the people that they were going into take over the land from basically were shaking in their shoes because they had heard of what happened at the time of the Exodus. They'd heard of the plagues. They'd heard of the Red Sea parting and them going through on dry land. They'd heard of the destruction of Pharaoh and his army as they were drowned in the Red Sea. So these things became renowned throughout the world. So not just in Canaan, but everywhere. And so God's glory was. Sorry, what was that, Tim?
Sorry, and sorry to jump in here, Steve. I was just going to relate and affirm that these 10 plagues, and especially the last of them, the death of the firstborn, is memorialized and celebrated every year by faithful Jews even now in the holiday they call Pesach, and that we would call Passover. And my son-in-law, who is Jewish, he recounted to me the story of how the youngest son has to ask the father, what did all these things mean? But what made me think of it, Steve, was these cool little icons you've got up on here, and the way that Jewish mums today teach their children of the plagues. And so my son-in-law can tell you about when he was, 10 years old, and his mum would have jelly baby frogs, and they would all get to eat the jelly baby frogs. And what do the frogs mean? Well, that's the second plague, etc. So I think it's really interesting how powerful these stories can be, and the importance of passing these things on. They remain in our consciousness.
So it's interesting that Passover it kept reminding Israel themselves during those 40 years about their deliverance, and yet it didn't really have the impact that maybe it had to other people. It's really quite interesting, human nature,
Mm.
how, things that we might witness ourselves, how soon we forget those things when we're under pressure.
And the manor is an example of that, I suppose.
Yeah, true, true.
Mm.
So just talking about that very last plague, it was very significant. As you mentioned, it was the Passover, and it points forward again. There's all these little lessons about salvation and Christ, and that come through in all these in all the history of Israel. So here we have the angel of death was sweeping through Egypt, killing all the firstborn children, and it was only those who had sacrificed a lamb and painted its blood on the doorposts of their house were saved from death. And, you know, we can sort of see the parallel there with Jesus, the Lamb of God. He died on the cross. He shedded his blood that death would ultimately be overcome in each of us. So, there's this great little parallel there, and they just keep on coming.
Mm.
All right, well, just a little about the journey. We're getting closer to the law. So the journey from Egypt was a dramatic one. Having initially let the Israelites go, the Egyptians soon changed their mind when they realized that their free labor was walking out the door. They rode after them to recover their slaves and property. And the parting of the Red Sea for safe passage, the drowning of the Egyptian army, all showed this awesome power of the invisible God of Israel. So they were on a journey to the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And they continued their journey until they had a little bit of a detour down to Sinai. And here Moses received the law from God. And Tim's going to expand on that shortly. But one of the other things that I found interesting here is that they also were given plans for the construction of a tabernacle. And for the first time since the Garden of Eden, it's mentioned that sort of God dwelt among men and his presence was revealed within this special building. And probably more particularly on the Ark of the Covenant, or we could almost call it the Ark of the Promise, um, which was in the most holy place of the tabernacle. Now, the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy record the details of their journeys through the land there. As you can see, it's a little bit of a windy journey there. And it was really due to their lack of trust in God that a journey that was sort of less than a year, maybe 2 years, actually turned into the journey of a lifetime. And
I
those
thought it
who'd
was a problem
seen,
with their sat nav, Steve.
sorry?
I think it was a problem with their sat nav, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, the satellites must have been down.
Yeah,
Yeah, run out
40
of
years.
batteries.
Yeah.
But it was really due to their lack of trust in God that this happened. Even though they'd seen the miraculous plagues, they'd walked through walls of water, going through the Red Sea. I mean, how could you forget something like that? They'd seen Pharaoh's army wiped out. I mean, I find it unbelievable, really, that after seeing all these things, they still lacked trust in God. And and at one stage, well, actually more than once, they wanted to return to Egypt. Uh, and yeah, just unbelievable that they wanted to return to slavery. Although they didn't think of the slavery, they just thought about the food. So yeah, quite telling. So let's have a quick look at a couple of spiritual elements here. And it's interesting how in the New Testament, Paul, under inspiration of God, has this to say about this period of Israel's history. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. So there was a cloud above them, there was sea on both sides, and were all baptized into Moses. So it's talking about they were completely encompassed by basically water, and all ate the same spiritual food. They basically ate the manna in the wilderness that was provided by God. They all drank the same spiritual drink, and we may recall that during that journey, Moses struck the rock and water came out of the rock, so miraculous water. For they were all drinking from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And so we see here again the spiritual lessons that keep coming out of all this historical events that took place with the children of Israel. But we have a bit of a footnote. God was not pleased with most of them, for they were cut down in the wilderness. These things happened as examples for us, so that we will not crave evil things as they did. And it made me think about, basically they left it. They had this journey of a lifetime that really did take their entire life, and they didn't end up getting there in the end. It was those that were 20 years old and upwards who were going to die in the wilderness. And because they wanted for 50 years, well, there we go. There's 60 years of life, and it's a little bit like our own individual journey of life. We're basically growing up until we're 20 years old, or some say you come of age of 18, others 21, some probably a little bit later, but we all mature at that time, and then we've got 40 years of life to really make a decision as to whether we're going to trust in God, commit ourselves to Him, or whether we're going to just do our own thing, and look forward to an entry into the promised land by being faithful. So yeah, I think there's a couple of good lessons there. And finally, my last one, some words from Moses himself. Here he was, the end of 40 years, a journey, the purpose of the wilderness wandering was sort of revealed here, and spiritually the purpose of our own lives. It was really to test where our loyalty lies. So you must, as we read here, you must keep carefully all these commandments I'm giving you today, so that you may live, increase in number, and go in and occupy the land that the Lord promised to your ancestors. Remember the whole way by which He has brought you these 40 years through the wilderness, so that He might, by humbling you, test you to see if you have it within you to keep His commandments or not. So yeah, I think there's those good points there to test you. Where does our loyalty lie? And to humble you. Will you keep the commandments, or will you be like Adam and disobey the God of the universe and suffer the consequences? It's our choice, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So on that point, Tim, I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. So let me see once again if I can thread the needle. I think I want that one there. Will just be exactly the same.
There we are.
Right. So Steve, this is kind of difficult proposition to talk about the law of Moses. Just to consider its importance. And I don't want to understate it, and I don't want to overstate its importance. On that slide you had up before, we had that there were in that trip from Egypt to Israel, we have books Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and we've had Genesis. We've gone through that. And these 5 books, of which we're talking about 4 of them really just in this trip, these 5 books make up the Torah in Judaism, which is considered to be the first and fundamentally most important section of Scripture to a practicing Jew. And so Cody, my son-in-law, he told me for his bar mitzvah, so when he turned 13, he had to have memorized and be able to chant a section from the Torah. And it's kind of like a Bible reading. Your date of birth dictates what your reading is going to be for your bar mitzvah. And bless him, I think Cody had to chant from memory a section of, I think it was 2.5 or 3 chapters out of Leviticus. And he said he got to the very last sentence, and Cody then, bar mitzvah typically happens at 13. He said he got to the very last sentence before his voice broke. And the audience really found it somewhat amusing. But, you know, this was being able to repeat the section of the Torah was an indication of your coming of age. It was that test that you were doing. So a very important part of being Jewish. And if we go over into the New Testament and we look at Jesus' interaction with his contemporaries and with other, shall we say, Bible authorities of his day, a lot of their discussion was over the interpretation and the application of these 4 books. And Steve, when we were talking last night, you pointed out to me in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is being tempted to go his own way and do his own thing, just like, you know, the Israelites here, that he counters it with, thus says the Lord, and he fights off this temptation by quoting 3 times from the book of Deuteronomy. So, you know, maybe that was the section of the reading that was in his mind at the time, but it clearly was very important. And it's not only that, but I can think you just quoted from First Chronicles, and we're going to have a look at a couple of verses in Romans, and there's also the book of Hebrews, which all specifically refer back to things that are established in the Torah, in these 5 books, and in particular in the Law of Moses. So that does indicate some of the importance of the Law of Moses. So having said that, having said what, you know, having placed it appropriately, we've got up on screen the 10 Commandments, and I'll tell you now, I'm going to tell everyone what the first 8 commandments are, and I am going to ask what commandments 9 and 10 are. So I've given you fair warning. Steve, can you keep an eye out for under the chat or the Q&A? What are the 9th and 10th commandments? Now, I think many of us would know the first couple of commandments. And these are specific and direct with regards to God. You will have no gods before me, and you will not make for yourself a carved image, and you will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and you will remember the Sabbath day. And Steve, you referred back to the 7th day a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Genesis. You will remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The 5th commandment, as is commented on in the New Testament, is the first commandment with promise. So, Steve, can you tell me what the first commandment with promise is?
I think that the first commandment with promise was that got me there, is it the honor your father and your mother?
That's right.
Your days may be long in the land.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Honor your father and mother. So that's the first 5 commandments. Now, have we, Steve, just so that I know, have we had anybody putting up what commandments 9 and 10 might be?
No, I don't seem to have anything coming through.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll talk slowly.
Oh,
commandment?
yes, we've got
Yeah,
number 10.
cool. Okay.
Would you like me to tell you what the
No, no, no. We'll do number 10 when we get to number 10.
okay?
So we still need number 9. Which shall we give a clue on that one?
Sure.
It has we might think it has as much a legal standing as anything else. How's that? Would that be, have I got that right? That's the 9th commandment, not the 10th, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So the 6th is you shall not kill. The 7th is you shall not commit adultery. And the 8th is you shall not steal. Okay. Have we got number 9, Steve? Have we got
No,
it?
we don't.
No, we don't.
I think you've stumped everyone.
Okay. You shall not bear false witness. And what about number 10, Steve?
Okay, we've got a comment here, do not covet.
Was that just directed at you, or is that what we think the 10th commandment is?
I think it was the 10th commandment because it's got number
Okay.
10 in front of it. And it
right.
wasn't
Okay.
directed at me.
No, okay. So you shall not covet is the 10th commandment. And we've split these. You might recall that there are 2 tablets. And so we've said, okay, well, let's assume that there are 5 commandments on one tablet and 5 on the other. If we do that, we can see then that the first 5 commandments have something in common, and the last 5 have something in common. The first 5 are with regards to God and to those in authority above us. And the 5th commandment is sort of affirming our parents' position of honor, which is good to remember and remind
So what about
ourselves
the
of.
Sabbath day then? How does that fit?
Well, can we go back to what you suggested the Sabbath was for back in the first talk? When it was meant to be a day in which you paused and reflected on what God had created.
Yep.
I think it's a pretty good answer.
Yeah.
We
That's a
actually
good pass.
Thank you. I always honor it. Father and mother, I think, refers to, in some ways, Steve, anyone older than yourself, especially those who are no longer in that 20 to 60 bracket, and who probably their life is pretty much over, and so yes, Obi-Wan, I'll honor you too.
Thank you.
And the second tablet, if you like, the second set. If the first 5 are our relationship to God and our parents, Steve, could you typify what these other 5 might be with regard to?
Well, I would say they're our relationship with other people. Yeah. Cool. Yep.
Yeah. And so if we think then about this very well, so this is Jesus when he's engaged in discussion with his contemporaries, where they say, what's the first commandment? What's the second commandment? He says, well, the first commandment is you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And we could practically say that these 10 commandments can be divided up in that kind of way. Whether or not that is what Jesus was thinking of, or if that is indeed what is at the center of those 10 commandments. So that's what the commandments contain, the 10 commandments. Now, I think, Steve, and I suspect you'd know better than me, I think these are the 10 commandments, but if we go back through the 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, I think there's actually something like 620 Commandments.
Yeah, I think it's in the
It's
600s. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yep. These are the 10 that appear to be the ones that are carved onto the tablets and are the 10 commandments. And I would suggest that, with the exception of maybe remembering the Sabbath, most of them have carried on. I hesitate to say, in Judeo-Christian society, certainly until the last, I don't know, 100 years. Um, you know, I would have said that these 9 of these 10 at least would have been agreed to be at the heart of our communities.
Mm.
Unfortunately, not so now. And, it might not be any coincidence that as we have lost some of the reverence for God that are contained in the first 4 commandments, we've also lost reverence and honor for our families and also for our neighbors as well.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
So we talked about the importance of the law and how it featured in um, in Old Testament life, in New Testament life, in New Testament writings, and in Jewish society even up until today. But what was its purpose? And for this, I thought we'd go to Romans, and I'm using a different translation here. Steve and I were talking about this translation. We've talked about translations a little bit before. And this is one by J.B. Phillips. And both Steve and I like J.B. Phillips' way of passing his translation with the primary motivation of it being understandable, relatable. And so this is how J.B. Phillips translates the Apostle Paul when he's talking to the Romans in Romans chapter 7. He says, it can scarcely be doubted that in reality the law itself is holy and the commandment is holy, fair, and good. Can it be that something that is intrinsically good could mean death to me? No, what happens is this. At the touch of the law, sin was forced to express itself as sin, and that meant death for me. The contact of the law showed the sinful nature of sin. So Paul says, he says a number of things here, but I'll just pick up a couple of things that I think are germane. Firstly, he says, without a shadow of a doubt, the law that was given to Moses is good. So how can it be that it's bad to me? And the answer is that the law, in telling us what to do or not to do, echoes that experience of Adam and Eve in the garden. There was one law, and if there hadn't have been that law, there wouldn't have been sin, because Adam and Eve wouldn't have broken the law. So it is with the law of Moses. Paul goes on to say that the law defined what sin is. And he goes on to say later on, every time that we battle against our conscience and lose, the fact that we have a conscience and that we do something that we say we don't want to do confirms that we think that the thing that we should have done is the good thing. It's not when we break one of those 10 commandments, that we do it because we don't think it's a good commandment. We do it through our own compulsions, and we regret it. So the law itself is good. That's the summary of all of that. But the law can't make men good, and law itself can't make men good. And Paul goes on. He's talking about this battle that he has with his conscience. When I come up against the law, I want to do good, but in practice I do evil. My conscious mind wholeheartedly endorses the law. I know what's the right thing, yet I observe an entirely different principle at work in my nature. And a couple of verses earlier, he says, the commandment which was meant to be a direction to life, for instance, the example he uses here is do not covet. Do not covet is meant to point me to life. But when I then do covet, I break the law. And as he said before, the contact of the law shows the sinful nature of sin. And therefore, I found that this commandment, in breaking it, is a sentence of death. So we can see from all of this, if we just look at the bolded, the law itself is good, but it cannot make men good. And so this, again, I'm suggesting, Steve, is part of putting the law in its right place. Why we have, I liked your phrase, the Ark of the Promise. Is that right? That was the phrase you used. So, and in the same way, we have the Old Covenant or the Old Testament, I'll say the Old Law, and as Paul goes on to talk about in Romans, a new law, a new covenant, a new testament, a new agreement, a new promise. That is the reason that we have the New Testament. Having the law shows what sin is, and it's through the new law that we have salvation from sin. So it is important, without a shadow of a doubt. I will skip through this very quickly. In the New Testament, once again, we can see why God has given the law. Then, if the law can't make us good, what can it do? It can teach us to exhibit the nature of God, what God is, by pointing out what sin is. We can look to the opposite to that and identify what God is. And Matthew sums up the law and the prophets. Sorry, Jesus sums it up in Matthew. In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the essence of the law and the prophets. And that's repeated by Paul in Galatians. And not only was the law then to teach us to exhibit the nature of God in human behavior, but in exhibiting it to preach the gospel. And Jesus in parable says, if you cannot see me in the law and the prophets, then you won't be convinced of my resurrection. Effectively, I'm very much paraphrasing that, and I strongly suspect there's a better paraphrase than that. But Luke where we find him saying this, goes on to explain that after he's risen from the dead, he appears to two of his disciples, and from the law and the prophets, he explains that actually the law and the prophets is all pointing forward to him. And Steve, you mentioned a great example of that with the Passover before.
Yeah, well, we see it over and over again, don't we?
Yeah,
All
yeah.
through.
You mentioned the mercy seat. Well, you mentioned the Ark of the Covenant. In the mercy seat there, we see referred to, I think, in Hebrews, and the priest, the high priest, again, is looking forward to Jesus. So, the law itself is important, but it's important beyond itself, beyond simply being instruction by which to live, because as J.B. Phillips summarized it, the law is good, but the law cannot make man good. So there we go, Steve. I've pretty much blown my time,
Well, hopefully everybody will forgive you by not disconnecting and let you have a few more minutes.
Okay, all right. So look, we'll just look at one example here. We had said a few weeks ago that we were going to look at what evidence there is within the Bible, which, shall we say, gives evidence for itself. And we did the test of the texts back in week 1, and we said we'd look at science and medicine. So we're just going to look at one example from this. Now, Steve, we know that you mentioned Moses grew up in Egypt, and he lived in the court of Egypt for 40 years. And we know that we read that Stephen in the New Testament says that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was mighty in works and deeds. And so Moses knew what the current teaching was, what the current medicine was for how to sort somebody out. So here's a couple of things taken from the medical handbook of the day. To cure blindness, mix pig's eyes, antimony, red ochre, and honey, and pour it into the sufferer's ear. And for an embedded splinter, apply worm's blood, and S is done. Now, so Steve, my question for you is, what is antimony?
Well, I believe that it's something that you find in the ground. It's a mineral.
Okay. Anything more? I'm guessing you haven't used it recently.
No.
No. Well, can I tell you that antimony, they think it might come from a French word meaning monk killer. Yep. Because monks were alchemists, or alchemy was undertaken by a number of monks. And when
It's a different word though, isn't it? Than antimony.
This is French apparently, and this
Okay.
is what Wikipedia says. So
Okay.
it must be right. So apparently it means monk killer, and the idea is that when they were working with this mineral that you mentioned that they got from the ground, it would kill them. And antimony comes from the same family of minerals as arsenic.
Nice.
Yeah. So you can imagine that potentially extracting antimony as a mineral, you may be getting the vapors off it and all that kind of stuff. Here's what Wikipedia says. Inhalation of antimony dust is harmful and in certain cases may be fatal. In small doses, antimony causes headaches, dizziness, and depression. Larger doses, such as prolonged skin contact, may cause dermatitis or damage the kidneys and the liver, causing violent and frequent vomiting, leading to death in a few days. So I thought this was interesting. because the Egyptian idea at the time was to cure blindness, take antimony and pour it into the sufferer's ear, among other things. And it seems to me if they weren't the sufferer before, they'll be the sufferer afterwards, because and they did the same with mercury, for instance, up until the 1700s. Mercury itself was used to attempt to cure various ailments. And I think the cure being worse than the disease is certainly one of those things with mercury. And the other one that I noted here, the other one that I selected was, for an embedded splinter. So you've got you've got something stuck in your finger or in your foot. Apply Ass's dung. Now,
Sounds like a tetanus problem there, doesn't it?
yes, yes, this will certainly cause your foot to fall off. Now, maybe it works, but I don't know of anybody who's prepared to try it and find out. The point being, I guess, in amongst all of this is that even though Moses grew up in a time when these were the common cures, none of these types of things appear in the law of Moses. So what does appear in the law of Moses then? I mean, does the law include anything about medication or anything of that nature? Well, to be fair, the law of Moses isn't a medical textbook. It's not a scientific text either, but there are spiritual lessons and there are real physical lessons contained within the law. And one of the examples that we have there is the law was given to show man's need due to uncleanness. And Steve, I think you referred back to sacrifices and the like, in the Garden of Eden. And that's driven by the same thing. So this uncleanness was taught, and the Israelites were meant to bring this to mind when they were thinking about the regulations that the law had with regards to washing and hygiene and waste disposal and disease control. And all of these things are specified in the law of Moses. So the law of Moses doesn't tell you how to get a splinter out of your leg, but it does tell you about what is necessary for when you should wash, for instance, and how you should wash. With regards to disposal of waste, and with regards to quarantine for disease control, and with regards to hygiene and disposal of contaminated materials and the like. So these things, they all have a direct physical benefit for the community, as well as being intended to have a spiritual lesson among them there.
Yep.
We don't have time to go into it, but the idea of hand washing, for instance, only came into favor. Steve, do you know when that would be? Do you have any idea when?
I don't remember the date. I don't think I was around at the time.
Well, I'm going to have to take your word for it. We can always carbon date you to check on this.
Sure.
But hand washing itself only became popular in medicine. I was going to say in modern medicine, but I don't think we could call it modern medicine. Ignaz Semmelweis brought this in the face of great opposition in the 1870s. So before then, physicians and doctors did not wash their hands. And the signs of blood, etc., all over your aprons, and that was a sign of prestige. It was like your uniform to show that you were a surgeon. Hand washing was advocated, was part of Jewish life, but was not part of a surgeon's regime until the 1870s. And it wasn't until the 1980s, in fact, that hand washing was made a prescriptive requirement under the American Code of Medicine.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So,
1980s.
yep, 1980. So, I think you sit somewhere roughly in the middle, don't you, Steve? Somewhere between the 1870s and the 1980s.
Close to the 80s, 1980s, should I say. But I mean, I guess even when you think about it, it was used then, but even during COVID, hand washing became
Yes. Yeah.
again very much under the spotlight, and we all learned how to wash our hands again because
Yes.
probably we got a bit slack at that, and so everybody was washing their hands. But
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely right. So it's actually quite prescriptive in the law of Moses what washing looked like, and it's interesting that when you're making a sacrifice and therefore you're dealing with dead animals, and spilt blood and things of that kind of nature, there were requirements for it, and there was a requirement that you were using running water and not stagnant water, and that you had to clean whatever it was that you were using before you reused them. And if you couldn't clean them, you had to break it, destroy it, so it couldn't be used again. So there are some very interesting matters that we don't have time to have a look through here, but with regards to the requirements that sit under the law. And I don't want to make too much of it, but if we compare these instructions that God gave to Moses in the law of Moses, and we compare that to instructions to pour dangerous chemicals into our ears or stick dung on our embedded splinters, we can see which one of those has stood the test of time.
Actually, it's interesting, this one you've got here up on the screen with the Black Death, because wasn't it the Jews were blamed for the Black Death because it didn't affect them so much?
I don't know. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was because they washed, and
Right.
whereas the other population, the rest of the European
Yep.
nations, weren't as clean, and so when all the rats were around, which were spreading it, the Jews weren't impacted so much.
Well, unfortunately, it seems that whatever occasion there was to blame the Jews was usually.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's probably just true as well.
Yeah, and there's a famous case in the UK of a village which, when the Black Death broke out in it, the village shut itself off from all of the neighbouring villages. It quarantined itself so that it wouldn't spread the Black Death to the neighbouring villages. Just something that sort of comes to mind. So, in conclusion, some of these instructions and ideas that are within the law were so far ahead of their time and were contradictory and completely out of step with the wisdom of Egyptian culture, potentially, and in many, many cases is a lot more in step with our practices and things, as you said, Steve, with regards to COVID, that really resonate with us. So much more than, it's so easy for us to look at the, what the Egyptians said, or Pliny the Elder, or all of these, people of antiquity, these ideas on, how to sort things out, which would probably kill you in some cases. Not so the law of Moses. So for that reason, this is not a proof that this is the word of God, but it is one of the planks that shows that it is the word of God. So, Steve, I will throw it back to you now.
Just give me a tick here, and I will share my screen. Here we go. Right, we have a question in the Q&A, and with your Jewish background there, Tim, you might be well placed to answer this one. Why did the Jews think Jesus was breaking the law of Moses when he cured people on the Sabbath day? I don't think we read anything like that in the Torah.
Right. So dare I say it, Steve, my Jewish son-in-law hates it when I say to him, "Hey, Cody, why do people who follow the Jewish faith do this or do that?" And he's like, "Hey, I'm not your rabbi, I'm your son-in-law." But I guess having said that, I think it's very interesting. The Jews of Jesus' day had the same problem that we have in reading, for instance, the King James Version. In as much as the Jews of Jesus' day are taking something written 1400 years before and trying to understand its relevance to their lives then. And so what they were doing was they were looking at the commandment, honor the Sabbath, and they were saying what honor the Sabbath means is do no work of any kind.
Mm. Yeah, well,
And
that was the commandment, wasn't it? Not to do any work, and
yep.
yet
Now
they described that as work, I suppose.
I'll give you an example, Steve. The present application of that is that the most fastidious practicing Jews, and this isn't meant to be derogatory, this is how this commandment might be applied now.
Mhm.
The most fastidious Jews will not turn a light switch on the Sabbath day, okay, because that's doing work. The electricity, the use of the electricity is the work. So you turn the light on, before the Sabbath starts. So once again, they are looking at the commandment and say, so how do I apply it now? And Jesus then said, and we were talking about this last night, Steve, Jesus said to those who rebuked him, look, there are two commandments. There is one that says, do no work on the Sabbath, and you think me healing somebody is work, which, he gives them a dig about. But he said there's also the commandment that says, if you see your neighbor's ox stuck in a ditch, you must get it out. And there's nothing in that law that says you cannot do it on the Sabbath. So you've got two laws that are potentially at loggerheads. And he says, which one are you going to give the priority to? And he says, actually, you have mercy on the animal, and it's an animal, not even a person. You have mercy on the animal first.
Interesting, isn't it? Like you could argue that actually God's honor is more important, and yet it's sort of almost it's encouraging us to say, well, looking after our fellows is right up there with honoring God.
Yeah, well, Jesus gives that, that parable in Matthew 25, where he says, when you do it for these, the least of my brethren, you do it for me.
Yeah.
Effectively, when you honor your neighbor, you honor me. When you're doing it in commandment, if you're following my commandment to do it, then you're honoring me. Yeah, but no, it is an interesting one, isn't it?
Great. Thanks for that answer. Okay. Well, don't know what else we've got there. Yeah, I guess a bit of a homework challenges there is whenever you're reading, I guess have a look for references to the Law of Moses. You will see it right through the scriptures, both the Old and the New Testament. And if there is anything that you're curious about there, jot it down for next time, and we'll do our best to get some answers for you.
Don't you remember that when we did that session on questions, Steve, that we said don't always expect to get the answers?
Well, that's true. Yeah, we'll do our best.
Maybe we shouldn't, just to perpetuate that principle.
And also a reminder about reading plans. Feel free to help yourself to one of those at onlinebibleseminars.com and look at the resources page. If you want to start something new or a different reading plan, then there's a wealth of those there for you, just waiting. So please engage. All right, so we've ticked off 4 of our 10 weeks. So next week we're off to King David, and we'll find out how he relates to some of the previous people that we've seen and some of the promises of God, and how that relates to, I suppose you'd call him the second king of Israel, rather than the first, and but probably one of the most well-known and renowned kings, arguably.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending tonight, and we will look forward to catching up with you next week. And have a great week, and God bless.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night
Thank
to
you.
all.